In the state of Kansas, there's only one four-year university west of I-135. In today's episode of History in Hays, we learn how Fort Hays State University was founded and how it continues to serve western Kansas. Hello and welcome back to History in Hays, where we are exploring some of the historical events of Hays and the surrounding areas. You may remember that in the first episode, we discussed Fort Hays. Well, we are also talking about Fort Hays today, but we're talking about Fort Hays State University, which was named after the military fort. With me at the moment is Brian Gribben, Coordinator of Government Documents and Special Collections at Forsyth Library at Fort Hays. Brian, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So before we really get started, could you just briefly introduce yourself and kind of explain what it is you do at the library?
Okay, so officially I'm a program specialist. This is non-teaching faculty. At the library we have obviously librarians, both tenure track and NTT, as well as myself and another colleague who are program specialists, in as much that our duties basically detail like non-teaching activities, things like collection curation, exhibit design, a whole host of activities, right? Originally, I'm a historian by trade. I'm a Europeanist, so American West, Trans-Mississippi West, Progressive Era, not my wheelhouse, although, by necessity, you've got to learn most of that, right? Within Special Collections itself, we have a wide variety of primary source materials collected based on, the relevance to the university itself as an institution, the surrounding area. It sounds like you've already kind of touched on. Hays as a hell on wheels, the fort itself, as well as a pretty robust military archive. Special Collections also includes some early books and, of course, materials that support the surrounding community, genealogical materials like dealing with the history of the Great Plains, things of that nature.
Gotcha. So yeah, as I was saying, the university is named after the military fort, but as I understand, the first sort of education institution was actually built, or at least on some of the fort's land. Is that correct?
That's correct. So obviously what would become Fort Hays, the military institution, was contained on about 7,500 acres of what they call just a reservation under the supervision of the Department of War, what we now know as the Department of Defense, right? By the late 1870s, mid-1880s, pacification of indigenous peoples, right? The Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Pawnee had pretty much taken effect, and these people were consigned to, of course, reservations in Wyoming, Montana, Oklahoma, then quote-unquote Indian territory. So the need for the fort, right, it pretty much evaporates. So what are you going to do with this 7,500 acres? It gets transferred to the Department of Interior. So from the jump, right, there is this desire for Hays to kind of transform itself from this hell on wheels, from this kind of Wild West town that we still celebrate with, homages to Buffalo Bill Cody and Hickok and Custer, to, and I'm doing air quotes right now, a civilized community, right? One of the needs of this development of the Trans-Mississippi West is, of course, a robust education system. Late 1800s, dawn of the 20th century, you, of course, see in major metropolitan areas a full high school available to young people who had the luxury, the time, the money to access that, of course. Out here in central and western Kansas, it was pretty common just to have that one-room schoolhouse that maybe did what we would call a primary and partial secondary education, right? So usually maybe up to grade 10. And the purpose of that, of course, is to do what? Right? To ensure that students are literate, can do basic mathematics, and then can go out and be, competent in the workforce. Well, of course, the professionalization of a variety of careers and the credentializing that goes into becoming a doctor, becoming a dentist, the advent of like civil engineering, right, and major public works projects necessitates a educated public. But also with the dawn of the progressive era and coming on the heels of the populist movement, you also have this kind of democratizing project, right, in as much that citizens aren't just here to go out, earn a wage, and shut up, right? Rather, they're going to participate in that exercise of self-governance that's always had kind of starts and fits in our country's past. Okay, well, John Dewey, who was a philosopher and educator, determines that this idea, and he didn't do it alone, obviously, right? There's this trend of what would become kind of a liberal arts education that we're going to get to eventually here at what would become FHSU. This idea that one of the missions of education is to develop these like critical thinking skills and become a more well-rounded person. Your education's role is not just to prepare you for the workforce. Mm-hmm. Didn't start out like that, okay? But this idea of bringing a institution of, let's just say, higher learning to Ellis County, right, was also part of this civic project of the people who built Hays City, okay? Initially, that was mostly like that kind of like first, second generation of settlers, mostly Anglo, but of course the arrival of the Volksdeutsch from the Black Sea, from the Volga, from parts of Austria-Hungary, also wanted opportunities for their children, okay? So 1880s, probably one of the more notable figures of the early days of Hays, is Martin Allen. He's a land developer, speculator from Ohio, very interested in arborism, in botany, in horticulture. Sees the idea of this reservation, this unused, untapped resource south of Hays City, south of Big Creek, as an area of which you can have a experiment station, right? For a variety of projects, but also an area that could be set aside for at least an institution that could help educate the surrounding population. Now, at the time, Kansas had what was called a Kansas State Normal School. Normal school meant largely that it basically would teach the last 2 years of a high school education and provide enough instruction so that individuals could get certified to go out and teach in these one-room schoolhouses that dotted central and western Kansas, right? So the Kansas State Normal School is in Emporia, right, what would become ESU. So after a lot of starts and fits from Allen and some of the other city fathers in petitioning both the state legislature as well as Congress, we finally get legislation passed to devote that military reservation to establishing a western branch of that normal school, as well as setting aside land for that what would become the Kansas State Experiment Station. Mm-hmm. Okay?
Okay. So when did it go from the experiment station or the western branch of the Kansas Normal School? What transitions have to happen to get us a little further towards Fort Hays?
These are two separate entities.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The experiment station was always a outgrowth of the Kansas State Agricultural School, what would become, of course, K-State.
Yes.
Kansas State. The Western branch opens in 1902, and actually first day of school is in June, and it's not on what we now know as the Fort Hays campus. It's actually, classes are in session and taught at the military fort. These buildings have been abandoned, I think in 1888, largely dilapidated, but local interested parties went ahead and tried to renovate some of the existing buildings. Some of the officers' quarters were dedicated to housing some of the first faculty. And with this, the Western branch, the normal school, it was basically here to do last 2 years of high school and provide instruction to certify teachers to go, prospective teachers to go out and teach. Okay. So from its conception, it's viewed as part of this civilizing project, right? So the students attending the Western branch, of course, they were there to learn how to educate others, but there was also this spark of, hey, we're going to actually use these facilities to develop lyceums, to provide not just entertainment, but instruction to local community members as well. So from the jump, there was always this kind of aspiration to be something more. So about 1914, right? And even going into 1914, the faculty and locals would typically just refer to Fort Hays as the normal school. It kind of began to disassociate itself from the Western branch, of course. They had to petition, this is under Pitkin, and then later Lewis, they had to petition the Kansas State Legislature to recognize their separation from the Kansas State Normal School, as did what would later become Pittsburgh State, too. And what happens then is it just becomes the Fort Hays, Kansas State Normal School. Okay? Mm-hmm. It begins to evolve in fits and starts as far as what is offered. Obviously, you have this education, this pedagogical component, this teaching teachers how to teach, right? But in response, we're beginning to see really the mechanization of agriculture, right? So they also begin to offer what they call short classes in blacksmithing, in repair and maintenance of the combustion engine, right? Because you begin to see in ag that transition away from like steam power in threshing to like gasoline, petrol fueled machinery. So then you begin to offer, okay, what is education going to look like in the 20th century? And again, the progressive era really pushes towards this kind of beginning, this more well-rounded idea of a person. They're not just there to learn a trade, to learn a skill. So courses begin to be offered in music education, botany, different sub-areas in biology, we're talking zoology, things of that nature. And really that's kind of where this idea of moving away from just being a normal school starts. Now, at some point, I don't have the exact date in front of me, we begin to offer more than just that certification aspect and begin to offer actually tertiary courses. So that begins really to move Fort Hays into becoming an actual college.
Yeah, that like education that's strictly after high school. It's not just the last 2 years of high school.
Plus the certification.
Yes. Right? All right, and so you mentioned that some of these students were there at least at one point to learn how to teach others. And I believe when I was doing some research, wasn't at one point the words teaching college in the name of the university?
Yes, so 1923, it becomes the Kansas State Teachers College of Hays, right? Then after a while, I think by 31, it really doesn't accurately describe what is being offered here because the student body and the demands that they're placing on the administration extend beyond just, hey, we're just going to come here and get a degree in teaching, right? So 1931, this is still under President Lewis, Fort Hays becomes the Fort Hays Kansas State College, and it's going to basically be its moniker, its official title until the 1970s.
Gotcha. Okay, I thought that was very interesting, looking at all the different names this place has had over the years. You've touched a little bit on this in several different ways already, but I'll just ask you directly, but what significance did it serve to Western Kansas in the early days?
That's a good question. Beyond just kind of its alum going out and educating others, right? It provided, and it's not intended to be condescending, but it became kind of this epicenter of culture for the region, right? And we also need to remember that every community had a band shell. Every community tried to have some kind of civic programming, whether it was a lyceum or a theater troupe or whatever, right? But the university itself, especially after Sheridan, what's now Sheridan Hall, what was then Sheridan Coliseum was built, the focus was to really kind of make the university a place not just for students and faculty, but for the wider community.
Yeah, and it definitely still serves that same role today, right?
Friday night, went to a concert at Sheridan Hall, and again, the turnout's great. We also have seen, like, really from probably the mid-century, we have the High Plains Music Camp, which used to be the High Plains, it's just limited to the High Plains Band Camp, but it provides kind of a center for area students to come to and be exposed to new ideas, to meet other people that are pursuing the same interests.
Yeah. So aside from all of the different name changes and everything that went along with that, how else has the university changed in terms of education and what is offered here?
Okay, well, so many people listening to this podcast will be familiar with what we call CAMS, right? We've got the Kansas Academy of Math and Science, which provides, elite college level instruction to students who are still of high school age, right? It provides them a safe and secure living opportunity on campus, while at the same time being allowed to take college courses in a college environment, right? There's plenty of opportunities for secondary students to take college classes remotely, but this gives the students kind of a leg up in kind of acclimating to a university environment. We also have, of course, the Honors College. And one thing we really didn't touch on earlier is actually the emergence of Fort Hays from just a four-year college to the creation of its graduate programs.
Yeah.
Right. Fort Hays starts offering a Master's of Science. I'm going to get the date wrong here, but I think it's way back in the 30s. I think that's correct. I'm shuffling my paper here. Actually, that's a lie. I was a couple years off, 1929, right? And of course, from there on, we expands, offering a Master of Arts in a variety of disciplines, right? And with the creation of a separate graduate program in addition to the different accreditations you have to go through and the reorganization of the different programs into separate colleges, that's when we actually begin to achieve university status as a state comprehensive university, still largely focused on teaching undergraduate students, with much of the emphasis for faculty being on instruction, in addition to, of course, service and research. But really the expansion of different graduate programs, not just in the traditional liberal arts and humanities and the natural sciences, but within business and entrepreneurship, offering an MBA, offering, of course, other doctorate in nurse practitioning. It's been really significant for a institution in Hays, Kansas, in north central Kansas, to provide those kinds of pathways.
Yeah.
Right. To, again, we've moved beyond just being kind of provincial, and have just been offering opportunities to students in central and western Kansas, because we pull in students from all across the country. Because of really the strength of some of these programs, the notoriety, and I'm not trying to give any other particular department short shrift, but our biological sciences, particularly in its graduate program, a lot of students gravitate to Fort Hays to study under our faculty. The same would go for geosciences as well. Our philosophy program, it's now folded under, it's the Department of History and Philosophy. The philosophy graduate program is very well thought of, if not reflected in its numbers, in like the faculty quality, right? And again, I'm just showing my own bias in what I'm talking about, right? But having that kind of level of I should say, having access to these kinds of minds,
Yeah.
the faculty we have on campus, and this isn't boastful. I've did my doctoral work at UNL, and I would say within at least my field of study, the quality of faculty rivals that of a R1 research university. So.
With me now is Paul Nienkamp, Chair of the Department of History and Philosophy here at Fort Hays. Paul, thank you for joining me.
Very welcome.
Can you briefly introduce yourself and your background in the history discipline?
Sure. My educational background was, I started in math and physics, but then when I went to graduate school, it was history of science and technology. And my dissertation for my PhD was on land-grant schools, early agricultural and mechanical arts education, mostly in the upper Midwest between Nebraska and Michigan. But I also learned a little bit about Kansas State in the process. So it's really been education, the sciences, and that's what brought me into the field. And now I do a lot of American history, education history, whatever the department might need at any time. So that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. So this episode, of course, is all about Fort Hays State University. What did higher education look like in Kansas in the early 1900s when it was first founded?
When Fort Hays was first started, I believe it was 1902 when they got the legislation passed to start it. They already had Kansas State and the University of Kansas, two big flagship universities of the state. There were also several liberal arts small private colleges, particularly the eastern half of the state. There had been a few attempts in the western half of the state to start small colleges. Here in Hays, there was an effort for, I think it was Presbyterian College, only lasted a few years, or a year or two, I guess, and they ran out of funding. The concept of community colleges that we see a lot of today won't come until after World War II. So we're quite a ways from that sort of education at that level. But higher education, small private colleges were started by different groups, but the major state-supported universities, there wasn't anything in western Kansas. So the reason Fort Hays got started, the people here in Hays in this region of the state were looking for that opportunity, particularly a college that could help teach teachers. This is where you get to normal college. So Fort Hays was started as a branch college of Kansas State University, normal school for educating teachers to then go out and teach at the elementary and secondary level. From there, a lot of different things would happen over the next few decades.
Yeah. So in addition to being that teaching college initially, what sort of significance did the university bring to western Kansas in the early days?
In the early days, this was basically the only four-year institution in the western half of Kansas, other than small private colleges that were mostly very religion-oriented. So they had intended to produce pastors, ministers for mostly Protestant schools. Fort Hays, teachers' college, but they also had the idea that it could work as an extension of Kansas State University's agricultural role. So with Fort Hays, because it was on the old fort grounds that stretched, came here, where the campus is today, was basically what existed on the north side of Big Creek. On the south side, you've got the fort up on the hill, and then to the west, when you look into the skyline, you see the big wind turbines. That's still on university property. That's part of the farm now. Mm-hmm. And as you go south, you see a lot of big pasture areas. And the old fort used to have huge numbers of acres south of where the fort is that was just pasture land for the horses and cattle. So all of that land was seen as an agricultural opportunity to train farmers in better practices for Western Kansas. Mm-hmm. And then the teacher piece. So the normal college, they were producing teachers to go out into the communities to fill those teacher roles.
Okay. So the part of training farmers, is that what the experiment station was?
Exactly.
Okay.
So today we have the Kansas State University Experiment Station just on the south side of town. Mm-hmm. And it works with both crops and animals. And that's really what experiment stations were started as, was they were the applied piece of the college. So where teachers are going out into the field and teaching in the classroom, the farmers needed to practice with the animals, not quite vet school. That was still over in Manhattan. They could do a little bit of that, but it was mostly how do you raise and work with livestock? How do you grow crops in this area, because it's different kind of soil, different kind of climate than in the eastern part of the state. Mm-hmm. And that was really what all the experiment stations for all the land-grant universities were set up as, were experimental farms, that they could test stuff. They could test the soil, they could test fertilizers, they could test different kinds of crops and seeds. And so that's still to this day what the experiment station does, is to gather that information for this part of the state. There's another one down by Garden City. There's one near Manhattan, and there's two more, but I'm not real sure where they are.
Yeah. I know it might differ a little bit today, but back then when that was started, how would learning at an experiment station differ from just staying at home and learning on the farm?
That was the exact same question the farmers were asking. Why do I need to send my kid to college to learn this stuff? And at all the land-grant universities across the country, that was the question. Because even though it wouldn't seem like a lot today, it might be, $800 for a 4-year degree. Sound like much. Well, in 1900, that was a lot of money.
Yeah.
So it was difficult. But what the university mission rationale they gave to farmers was that we are learning better techniques by doing this work, and we are helping to train people to do that work in a better way. And we can get that to happen with the educational system. If you just keep your children on the farm and farm the way you think you should, it may not be the best way. Mm-hmm. Well, then you're attacking the farmers' knowledge and their practices, which sometimes didn't work. It's been a back and forth since the 1850s, when land-grant schools, really the agricultural schools, really started. And it continued through after the passage of the Morrill Land-Grant Bill that created land-grant colleges or funded them, all the way up to today. The experiment stations since, the 1950s and 60s have been much more of, we think of today as extension agents.
Right.
They'll train experts and then they'll send them out to the farms. They were talking about the same kind of thing in 1900, just that they were doing it with the students.
Right.
Well, that costs money instead of just having an extension agent come out and tell you stuff. So it's been difficult. But the people did see the benefit of having government-supported research so that they could do things better, get better crop production, better livestock production. But having training a farmer to go back and farm is different than training somebody to be an expert to come out and help the farmers.
Yeah.
So there's always been that balance. Probably what it shifted more to in the last, or since the 1950s, is more the business of farming.
Gotcha.
kids go to college to understand the business and finance end of things, the farming itself. We still have an agricultural department. We still have the experimental farm or university farm. We have the experiment stations, but they take that knowledge, but farming is still farming.
Definitely. Yeah. All right. So kind of pivoting a little bit, how did Fort Hays, but also higher education as a whole, sort of evolve through the 20th century after it got started?
So yeah, 1902 when it opened, branch of K-State. I believe 19 teens, 1920s, somewhere in that range, it became its own standalone university. And the emphasis for that was to be able to operate separately from Kansas State University. But they were still doing all the same things. They had the university farm. They could cooperate with the experiment station south end of town. That was all part of the Fort 2 over there. And then another piece that happens right after World War I. So during World War I, I think the bill was passed in 1917. That was an attempt to specifically address, because land-grant schools in the engineering and mechanical arts that they focused on was really becoming professional engineering. Your professional civil engineer, professional agricultural, or professional mechanical engineer. They needed something as a trade school. They needed to teach the trades to students. Land-grant schools, even Fort Hays State University, had done a lot of trades training. So plumbing, electricity is a pretty new thing, turn of the century. But all those kinds of things that we think of as trades, those were, the farmers, the businessmen, they were saying, well, it's too expensive to go to college. But the universities were looking for a way to professionalize those careers. So 1917, right around 1917, the state creates essentially what are community colleges. Those pick up the trades. Today we think of automotive, kind of the lowest level of nursing practices, physicians, not physician assistants, but nursing assistants, auto mechanics, welding, electrical, building trades. Those are all part of community college efforts, even to this day. So the universities began to move more towards the career professionalism by the 1920s. 20s and 30s, all universities were pretty small. Fort Hays probably had 300, 400 students at most. Then during World War II, enrollments really drop off, obviously. But the universities picked up state contracts to help with the war effort. So Fort Hays, with the agricultural emphasis, would have been doing a little bit more agricultural work. Places like K-State, Iowa State in particular, had a nuclear research facility on campus paid for by the federal government. It still has it. K-State has had some things that the federal government contracts paid for too. So they get through the war with those efforts. Then after World War II, the universities begin, there's the baby boom for one. So they see this huge population of kids that are going to be coming up in about 20 years. So by the early 1960s, there's going to have to be a lot of education. But right after World War II, the GI Bill paid for college education. So now the universities are looking for a way to draw those veterans in. Government's paying for them to go to college. What do they want to get jobs in? So business schools expanded. Some of them became teachers. Others wanted to start a business. So you get all these the kind of colleges we see today within the university being reorganized or created to support all those GIs. And that goes through the 50s. Then by the late 50s, early 60s, you begin seeing these kids coming up who are the federal government and state governments paying large sums of money for math and science. We're in the midst of the Cold War. So the universities are saying, how can we support all the STEM and business so that the United States can become superpower? Those kinds of efforts, the focus on science and engineering and math, business, they carry us into the 1980s. So, 30, 40 years there. 1980s, they start to see a bit of a drop in enrollment, but the universities say, okay, what do we have to do next? Well, they go to something that had been fairly small scale prior to World War II and had not been a major focus after World War II, and that's distance education. What we know today is online. But through the 80s, early 90s, this was correspondence. So professors would record their lectures on tape and mail them out. And then the students would mail their assignments back to Fort Hays. They'd get graded, and back and forth it went. So that effort got started in the 70s, 80s, early 90s. And then with the internet, mid-90s and after, Fort Hays was one of the very early adopters of online education. And that became incredibly important during COVID. So
Yes.
it was kind of the culmination of all that kind of work. Still see a lot of emphasis on science and engineering, science and math. The business college is still big. The education college at Fort Hays has been strong for quite a while. When I first got here in the fall of 2011, some of the numbers that the education faculty were throwing around is that Fort Hays had more education students than most of they were far higher than the other universities. And at one point, we had more education students at Fort Hays than all of the other 5 institutions combined. So, and we still have a lot of education students. The college that has struggled in recent years, and this is across the country, but the College of Arts and Humanities, Social Sciences, we do a lot of the support work. So your English and literature, the history classes, philosophy, languages, sociology, political science, art, music. A lot of your general education classes fall into this college to kind of help you do better in all the other areas. But then our own fields supply people, the experts, to tell the story of this part of the country, to help people learn about politics and how governance works, to have people who have the support services for your community, mental health, etc. So even though nursing gets a lot of grant money and support, the business college puts out people that have high incomes, it all works together to produce people that can support the communities, both economically and socially and politically within Kansas.
Yeah. Kind of building off of that, how would you say, just based off what you've seen, how has Fort Hays adapted to the changing landscape of higher education?
Fort Hays has been on the front edge of a lot of it. Online education has reached a much wider portion of the community of Kansas than on campus can. Fort Hays was also one of the early universities to reach out internationally. We have the China programs that we have connections with. So the 3 modalities that they talk about: on campus, in person, online, and international partners. We have a larger population of students than some other schools do. We've also done things you might say traditional. You still have the nursing, biological sciences, pre-med program. We've got our business college. We've got our education college. The STEM college was started 6 or 7 years ago as a way to bring the sciences and math together. Prior to that, most of them had either been in the arts and humanities, arts and sciences college, or they had been part of the biological and human health college. So they got pulled out to focus more on the specific science and math work that they do. The humanities college got smaller, obviously, because they took most of those departments out. But we focused more on the social sciences, humanities, and how they can support students across the university in their careers, as well as, for instance, history. Half of our undergraduate students are education majors, secondary ed majors. So we still do a lot of that work as well. And state colleges like Fort Hays, Emporia State, Pittsburgh State, a lot of what they do is the people that are going to go directly back into the smaller communities that they came from. So Fort Hays is really focused on that over the last 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, so with that evolution and adapting to the changing landscape, how does the university serve Western Kansas today?
It's a good question, and one that has been posed by legislators and the Board of Regents. And the answer that the people at Fort Hays have come up with is that we uniquely serve Western Kansas, and not just Western Kansas, but Eastern Colorado, Western Nebraska, parts of Oklahoma, Panhandle of Texas. We have a wide reach. Now, legislators and the Board of Regents are very interested in how we're helping Kansas because the money comes from Kansas tax dollars. But we really do have a wider reach, and we're focusing on ways to help Western Kansas communities remain stable, as well as grow in some cases. As might be seen, demographics, a lot of small communities are declining. Businesses leave, population leaves, then the school closes. There are not as many farmers as there used to be. So communities have to operate a little differently, or you have to be able to work or live in a somewhat larger community like Hays, and then travel out to whatever the businesses are that you're involved with. So Fort Hays is kind of focused on those areas. How do we support communities? Teachers is one area. We help train people for small business. There's a Small Business Institute. The nursing program, a lot of those nurses go out to your regional hospitals and community clinics. Arts and music, they provide not only experiences, concerts and art exhibits for communities, but they're also helping students be able to turn around and go back to communities and offer those cultural components for the small communities in whatever they're doing. So Fort Hays is really focused on that kind of community development, working with partners like the Hanson Foundation, state grants, and then even in the southwest part of Kansas where there's a much larger Hispanic population, trying to reach into those communities. How can we support the diverse cultures that are in the state by helping them retrieve their own history, helping them expand, showcase their own cultures, just by support and some training through Fort Hays itself. And then in the last few years, 3-4 years, the president of the university has been working on these affiliations with North Central Tech, Northwest Tech, and those as two trade schools, helping Fort Hays reach down, I'm going to say down to those, reach over to those levels of trade practices, so that those students can continue to do what they want to do, but also have an opportunity to come into Fort Hays, maybe get a business degree, maybe get a 4-year degree in the applied technology, something like that. So we're diversifying in a lot of different ways too.
Awesome. Well, unless you have anything else to add, I think that will about wrap us up for this episode.
Okay.
So thank you so much for joining me today.
You're very welcome.
All right. Thank you. And thank you for listening to History in Hays. Tune in to our 5th and final episode to learn about the flood of Big Creek in 1951.